How do we reconcile these two opposed but complementary ways of looking at the world? The world of innocence, which sees the world as a happy place and is hopeful, and the world of experience, which is cynical and bitter, but is also capable of perceiving the injustices and the horror of the world. And the second question is, what's at stake? What's the goal of reconciling these two complementary opposites into one new kind of vision? And I think in order to answer the second question, which I'd like to talk about first, is we need to go back to the Songs of Experience in the introduction and talk about who this voice is that we are hearing in the Songs of Experience, who the voice of the bard is and what he sees and why he wants to describe these situations that we'll see. So if we look at that, we remember from our previous video that we've been enjoined to hear the voice of the bard who present, past, and future sees, whose ears have heard the holy word that walked among the ancient trees, calling the lapsed soul. Now, if you look at those lines, this calling, this participle calling, it's unclear what it's modifying in the previous verse. Usually a participle modifies the noun that's closest to it. And the noun that's closest to it is the holy word, that is the word of God walking through Eden. But it's also possible that calling modifies the whole previous verse. So in other words, it's the bard speaking the words of the holy word. In other words, God speaking through the bard, calling to the lapsed soul. And the lapsed soul, of course, lapsed, the fallen soul, is the one who might control the starry pole and fallen light renew. In other words, the lapsed soul, fallen humans, the ones who have fallen from the Edenic state, are the ones who might control the starry pole. In other words, control the skies. Of course, the skies are associated with heaven. And fallen light renews. So it's the humans who have the potential power to control the heavens and renew the Edenic state, and therefore return back to Eden. O earth, return. Okay, so then why is it that humans are incapable of understanding their power, their ability to control the skies? So let's look down to Earth's answer. So anyway, the piper, the bard is saying, "Turn away no more, why wilt thou turn away? The starry floor, the watery shore is givenly to the break of day. This creation is all yours. Why are you turning away from it?" And this is Earth's answer. This is the second poem in Songs of Experience. Earth raised up her head from darkness dread and drear. Her light fled stony dread, and her locks covered with gray despair. So this is the current state of Earth, trapped in this darkness. Now remember, in Blake's symbolic structure, this is an allegory of the human condition. So what he's doing is actually talking about the state of human society here, trapped in this darkness. And this explains why the human world, social world, is trapped in this darkness. It's trying to justify its problem. It's prisoned on the watery shore. Starry jealousy does keep my pen. Cold and horror weeping o'er. I hear the father of the ancient men. Now, the father of the ancient men is, of course, God, but it's not the actual God. It's the God that humans have created, the selfish father of men, cruel, jealous, selfish fear. In other words, Earth has been entrapped, according to Blake's mythology, within its own self-created version of heaven and earth and of God and Satan. And this is the human created version of God. selfish, Father of cruel. So the first thing that the humans have to recognize is that it is within their own power to break this heavy chain that freezes their bones, and that free love that's bound, that's in bondage bound, is bound only because of their own belief systems from which they need to be freed. This is what Blake will later call in the poem London the mind forged manacles. And of course, manacles are handcuffs, chains that chain your hands. And these are mind forged. They've been forged by the mind of humans. So the goal here is to break humans free from their own self-created limitations so that they can return to the Edenic state, can regain power to control the skies. Now we understand that the goal of combining these two sets of visions, the vision of innocence and experience, is to create a new vision which is able to understand the nature of the oppression under which human society lives, and also has the energy and hopefulness to overcome it and return to an Edenic state. Now, let's go back and look at the limitations of this vision of innocence and how that is addressed by the vision of experience. So let's go back to Songs of Innocence and let's talk about the chimney sweeper. Now, you have to know a little bit about the history at this particular point and what a chimney sweeper is. Basically, of course, homes are heated in England by coal fires for the most part. Most homes are heated by coal. And coal, naturally mined coal, puts off a lot of oily gases when it burns and smoke. And that oily gas and smoke will collect in the chimneys as creosote, which itself is very flammable, and it's very possible, which is, by the way, still true if you burn those Duraflame logs, that creosote can collect in your chimneys and line the surface of the chimney, which can then catch fire, which can burn your house down. Not only does it block the smoke getting out of your house and create a smoking fireplace and make your life miserable, but also it can actually cause a fire that will burn your house down. And so it's necessary to keep your chimneys clean. Now, the chimneys at that time were ceramic pots. They're called pots, but they were ceramic tubes made of stacking these short sections of ceramic tube, one above another, inside a bricked enclosure. That would be a chimney. So you would actually you'd have these circular tubes, and these circular tubes were pretty narrow, 10 to 12 inches across, usually. And so one of the only ways to clean them was to get someone small enough to get up in there and actually clean these chimneys. It's a very dangerous work because many of these chimneys were built hundreds of years before, and creosote eats away mortar. And so the bricks themselves that are holding these things together, the creosote is dissolving the mortar. And so the chimneys themselves become unstable and can collapse, especially if you're poking a brush into them. And so it's very possible that you could drop a couple of tons of chimney on your head if you're up inside the fireplace trying to push a brush through it. So it was dangerous work. And since the fireplaces themselves tended to be fairly small, you needed to have someone small to do it. So children were perfect for this work. So chimney sweepers tended to be children. Now, where they got the children for this work was because, remember, we talked earlier in an earlier video about the fact that we're in a period now where there's a switch over from agrarian society to industrial society. And in agrarian society, children can work. And also, it's useful for you to have lots and lots of children because children provide free labor. You don't have to pay your kids to work. And so the children do their part on the farm. But of course, when you move to industrial society, having lots of children is a liability because you have to feed these little brats until they become old enough to work, which is usually in their late teens, or at least their mid-teens. And so little children now become a liability. But of course, social behavior doesn't keep up with socioeconomic situations. And so people are still having lots of children, but now they don't have anything to do with them because they can't put them to work. And they also still have to feed them. And so, and in many cases, they can't feed them. And so they have a choice. Which of my children do I want to save? Who am I willing to sacrifice to save my children? And so one of the ways, in order to appreciate this, you just have to appreciate the horror of watching your children starve to death. One of the ways that you provided for some of your children is you sold your other children. You sold the ones that you could get rid of in order to protect the few. And one of the ways they sold them is they basically sold them into slavery. They were sold to adults who would use the children to sweep chimneys and for other kinds of labor. So the chimney sweeper, in this case, is a very small child who has been sold by his parent into this chimney sweeping labor, which of course was very dangerous because, as I said before, the chimneys could collapse. Also, they don't have breathing protection or personal protection devices, so they don't have masks, and so they're sitting there knocking down this very carcinogenic, sulfurous powder and creosote out of the chimneys and breathing it in. So these children would usually die of black lung at an early age, even if they weren't killed in a chimney collapse. So it was a very short, nasty, and brutish life. So in this poem, this is the situation that we're looking at. But in the Songs of Innocence, look at how it's regarded by this piper, by this speaker. And we're offered this very horrific situation at the beginning, but it's offered in a very hopeful way. So here's the poem. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So in your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run, and wash in the river, and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Clearly, what's going on here is we have this horrific situation. The child's mother has died when he was a baby, probably as a result of giving birth to children, which was at that particular time, especially for poor people, if you were told you were pregnant, it was roughly the same thing as being told that you had cancer. Your chances of surviving it were very low. So my mother died when I was very young, and his father sold him into slavery, while yet his tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. Okay, so sweep. So these children were set out on the corner of the street, and as merchants would do during the time, they would, a primitive form of advertising, they would just cry out their wares. So the merchants would walk along the street, the vendors would walk along the street and cry out their wares, and the child would be yelling, sweep, 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 sweep. So if someone needed a chimney sweep, they'd hire him. But of course, this child is so small, he can't say his S's yet. He's lisping. So he says, weep, 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 which is ironic. And Blake means it to be ironic because, of course, weep also means to cry in sadness. So in your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. So there's another, and these little children, by the way, they would all be sort of warehoused together. If you read Oliver Twist and Fagin and his group of children who are being raised as pickpockets. They're basically the same sort of thing. So there's another little boy, Tom Dacre, who cried when they shaved his head because, of course, you had to shave their head because it was a lot easier to keep them clean if they didn't have hair, both because of the lice and also because of the soot. So you say they shave your head, and of course, little children don't like having their head shaved. So he cried. But the speaker says, the little boy, says, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. So this is the positive, hopeful take on little slave children who are going to die in someone else's chimney, not having to cry because your hair won't be ruined by the soot. And so he was quiet in that very night as Tom was asleep, he had such a sight. So here's the dream. And this dream is the promise of traditional Christianity that Blake is criticizing, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And so obviously that could be the literal coffins in which they would be buried, but also it could be the earthly coffins of their mortal bodies. And when they die, an angel lets them out of these bodies or these coffins, one or the other, and set them all free, presumably sets them all free into heaven. And once they're all free, they are laughing and run and wash in a river and shine in the sun in heaven. And all of their earthly problems left behind, all of their bags would be the bags that carry their brushes so they can clean chimney, left behind. They rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. So if you're a good boy, if you do what you're told, if you shut up and clean those damn chimneys, and you just keep doing it until you die, then you don't have to worry about the fact that your father sold you into slavery, because you'll have the big white Father in the sky taking care of you. You'll have God in the sky taking care of you, and you'll always be happy. And so out of this dream, this promise of traditional Christianity, though the morning was cold, and this is, remember, is London. London is roughly equivalent to Vancouver. On its latitude is equivalent to Vancouver. So it does get cold there. And though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. So you do your job, you keep your head down, you live this miserable life, and eventually you will be rewarded with a happy place in heaven. So this is the positive take of the Songs of Innocence, looking at this horrible situation and seeing a hopeful end to it. But the other side of this, if we look at it from the perspective of an experience side, means that these children are being oppressed under the promise of an eventual reward that they'll get only after they die. So now we go down to the experience version of the Chimney Sweeper. It's not necessarily the same speaker, and it's certainly not the same tone, because this one apparently has both a mother and a father. The speaker of this particular poem is not the Chimney Sweeper himself, although he speaks in the poem. This one starts off with the first two lines are being spoken by the poet, maybe the bard, who is describing the speaker, asks him a question in the third line, and then the remainder of the poem is the chimney sweeper responding to this adult voice. So notice that because it's an adult voice speaking, this voice has necessarily a different perspective than the child chimney sweeper of the Innocence version of the poem. Okay, so this poem goes: a little black thing among the snow, crying weep, weep in notes of woe. Where are thy father and mother, say? And here's the child's response: they are both gone up to the church to pray. Because I was happy upon the heath and smiled among the winter snow, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And because I am happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury, and are God to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery. All right, so we have clear allusion to the first poem, crying weep, weep in notes of woe. That's the sweep, sweep from the Innocence version of the poem. And so the adult asks the child, where are your parents? And they're gone up to the church to pray, the child says. Because I was an innocent child, they clothed me in the clothes of death and taught me to sing the notes of woe. And the clothes of death here is both a literal and a symbolic meaning. The literal meaning is clearly the clothes of the chimney sweeper, and the chimney sweeper is a high mortality career. And so they dressed him up and sold him into chimney sweeping, which is going to cause his death. But also the clothes of death mean the sort of the mortal belief system that has made his entrapment into chimney sweeping possible, and taught him to sing the notes of woe. And of course, the notes of woe are the weep, weep in line 2. And then there's also the allusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, allusion to the first stanza in the third stanza. And because I'm happy and dance and sing, they think they have done me no injury. Because, of course, the child seeing things in this happy light in the first chimney sweeper, in the Innocence chimney sweeper, continues to dance because he looks forward to having God for his father and never wanting joy. because despite the misery of their life, the child is able to rejoice. They are gone to praise God and his priest and king. So remember, God and his priest and king here, this is the human created God who is continuous with the priest and the king, not the actual God of Blake's cosmology, who make up a heaven of our misery. And this line has two potential readings, two complementary readings. The first one is they use his mystery to justify heaven. If you all do their duty, they need not fear harm. If you continue to do your work, you will go to heaven. So they make up a heaven of our misery. And then the second reading, the first reading is the heaven justifies the misery. And the second reading is that heaven actually is created out of their misery, that one has to suffer to get to heaven. One has to suffer to get to heaven. That's the Listerine version of the world. It is only good for you if it tastes bad. And of course, Blake doesn't believe that. Blake doesn't believe you have to go through suffering to get joy. Blake believes that the joy is there being denied by the people who create the suffering. And so this poem is an experience critique of the point of view offered by the Innocence poem. And by the way, the experience critique is already implicit in the Innocence poem, but because the naive speaker, the chimney sweeper, is unable to see it, but us from the outside looking at it can see the horror of his circumstance. And now the experienced speaker, the bard, is looking at that same circumstance and seeing the misery. To see where this human misery, human created misery comes from, let's go down to page 142 in the Human Abstract. Now, this is a companion poem for the Divine Image from Songs of Innocence. But I just want to really quickly look at this because this explains Blake's version of traditional religion, the one that makes a heaven out of their misery. In the Human Abstract, the poem says, "Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor, and mercy no more would be if all were as happy as we. And mutual fear brings peace till the selfish loves increase. Then cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits with care. He sits down with holy fears and waters the ground with tears. Then humility takes its root underneath his foot. Soon spreads the dismal shade of mystery over his head. And the caterpillar and the fly feed on the mystery. And it bears the fruit of deceit, ready and sweet to eat. And the raven his nest has made in its thickest shade. The gods of earth and sea sought through nature to find this tree, but their search was all in vain. There grows one in the human brain." Now, I'm not going to spend as much time looking at this poem, but I do want to use this to connect the chimney sweeper to the next poem we're going to be looking at, which is Holy Thursday. And the idea is that pity is a wonderful thing, but the problem is that we have pity only because we have made people pitiful. And we have mercy only because we created situations where people need mercy. And so he goes on to say, the mutual fear that comes from this circumstance where we're all creating this horror that oppresses everyone. The mutual fear is what brings peace, and that mutual fear brings this alienation. This is where the self-centeredness and alienation come from. Till the selfish loves increase, then cruelty knits a snare and spreads his baits with care. So this is what's pushing us down to Ulro. You'll remember in our previous discussion. Okay, so he, that is cruelty, sits down with holy fears and waters the ground with tears. Then humility takes its root underneath its foot. So the human is creating this abstract notion of humanity based upon humility, and also at the same time spreads the dismal shade of mystery over his head. So he, on the one hand, has humility underneath and mystery above. And this is humanity. This is Humility is how the humans are seen here, and mystery is how deities are seen. He creates this within his mind, he creates this opposition between God and humanity. And then that mystery and humility is what creates the battles and the oppression and the misery that kill people, and the caterpillar and the fly feed on the mystery. And then once that tree is grown, it bears the fruit of deceit, which is attractive. And then the gods of earth and sea sought through nature to find this tree, but their search is in vain. It grows in the human brain. So it's the human connection, it's the human conception of the universe that has created this. So let's go back up and look at Holy Thursday. Now, Holy Thursday refers to the tradition in the Church of England in the Cathedral of St. Paul's in London on Holy Thursday. You remember, Holy Thursday is part of the week of Easter. So it's Holy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday. And as the conclusion of Lent, because the Lent is the period of fasting and self-abnegation. So at the conclusion of Lent, then we have the celebrations of Easter. And the beginning of the celebration of Easter, the beginning of the conclusion of Lent, is Holy Thursday. And Holy Thursday, one of the traditions in the Cathedral of St. Paul's is that the orphans from the city of London are gathered together and bathed and cleaned up and dressed up in nice clothes and then paraded into St. Paul's as a show of the benevolence and care that the city takes of its orphans. And so this Holy Thursday is a description of that tradition of the parade of orphans through St. Paul's. 'Twas on a holy Thursday, their innocent faces clean, the children walking two and two in red and blue and green. Gray-headed beetles walked before with wands as white as snow, till into the high dome of Paul's they like the Thames waters flow. Oh, what a multitude they seem, these flowers of London town. Seated in companies they sit with radiance all their own. The hum of multitudes was there, but multitudes of lambs, thousands of little boys and girls raising their innocent hands. Now, like a mighty wind, they raise to heaven the voice of song, or like the harmonious thunderings, the seats of heaven among. Beneath them sit the aged men, wise guardians of the poor. Then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. Okay, so what do we have on Holy Thursday? We have the innocent orphans, their innocent faces clean, walking two and two in their Easter dresses, shepherded by gray-headed beetles. Beetles were the sort of pre-police officers of the law. They were sort of a constable. And so they were the caretakers of the poor, but also the sort of enforcers of community law. And their sign of office was that they carried a white staff, a walking stick, a tall white walking stick, which is here a wand as white as snow. If you're familiar with Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, the beetle is Bumble, and Bumble is the one who Oliver Twist famously asks for more soup. And Beetle is a cruel moron who says at one point in the novel, the law is a ass. So the beetles here are kindly beings taking care of these orphans, their staffs of office are like white wands, white as snow. And then the numerous children flow into St. Paul's, the high dome of St. Paul's, like the waters of the River Thames. Oh, what a multitude they seem, these flowers of London town. Seated in companies, they sit with a radiance all their own. So they're radiant flowers, humming, raising their innocent hands. Thousands of little boys and girls raising their innocent hands. And then they sing to entertain the people who are taking care of them. Now, like a mighty wind, they raise to heaven the voice of song, or like the harmonious thunderings, the seats of heaven among. So it's like thunder in heaven, the song of these innocent, radiant flowers. Beneath them sit the aged men, wise guardians of the poor. So the adults who are taking care of these children are wise guardians who are taking care of these poor children who are stuck and who are orphans. Then cherish pity, lest you drive an angel from your door. And of course, the idea is that angels will masquerade as poor children to come test humans, and humans should take pity on these children and take care of them so they don't risk offending an angel. So take care of these little children who are actually angels. They're radiant flowers with innocent hands. Okay, so this is seen in a very positive, hopeful way. It is the wise guardians and the gray-headed beetles taking care of the innocent, radiant flower orphan children. So how do we look at this same scene through the spectacles of experience? And how we look at that scene is very different. There would be no more need for mercy if we didn't make someone poor, we saw in the human abstract. So that's exactly what we see when we look at Holy Thursday in the Songs of Experience. Is this a holy thing to see in a rich and fruitful land, babes reduced to misery, fed with a cold and usurious hand? Is that trembling cry a song? Can it be a song of joy? And so many children poor, it is a land of poverty, and their sun does never shine, and their fields are bleak and bare, and their ways are filled with thorns. It is eternal winter there. For wherever the sun does shine, and wherever the rain does fall, babe can never hunger there, nor poverty the mind appall. So this is a very different perspective. This perspective starts from the question, how can there be so many poor children? Where are the parents of these children? What has happened so that these children have no parents? And of course, the answer to that question is either the parents couldn't support them and they were cast off, or their parents are dead and they're orphans. So the one hand, innocence sees orphans being taken care of, and experience looks at it and says, why are there so many orphans? Where are all these children coming from? And the wise guardians of the poor here become the cold and usurious hand of society. Usury is money lending, and it was traditionally, it's a sin. Lending money for interest is a traditional sin. And then the children, of course, singing, is that trembling cry a song? Can it be a song of joy? That's disbelief, that's the possibility that this is actually a song of joy from all of these children who are poor, living in a land of poverty, and who have no hope and no future because their sun does never shine and their ways are filled with thorns. Because wherever the sun does shine, wherever there is no poverty, then there is no hungry children. There are no hungry children or poor people whose minds are blighted by their starvation. Okay, we have one more poem to look at in Songs of Innocence and Experience before we move on. And believe me, I would like to look at a lot more, because each time you look through these poems, it tells you something more about Blake and his mindset, and it's helpful to understand him. But we simply don't have time to go through all of them. So we're going to look at probably his most famous and most often anthologized poem. It may be one that you've seen before in a poetic anthology or encountered in another class. And that, of course, is London. So this is a standalone poem. It doesn't have a complementary companion poem in Songs of Innocence, but it does talk a lot about what Blake sees in his contemporary society. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. All right, so there is a tremendous amount going on in this poem. There are lots of subtle and implicit references to Blake's cosmology. So let's go through and how he's using this language to express implicitly that cosmology. I wander through each chartered street. So the question is, what's a chartered street? And it's footnoted, but the word actually has two potential echoes here. The first one, of course, is the idea of a charter. And you're familiar with a charter school. I'm sure. Charter schools are special schools that are allowed to exist within the public school system, but run by semi-private or private entities. A charter is basically, it is a letter allowing something to exist. A charter from the king means that something can be brought into existence. So if you're the charter, if you have a charter for your club, that means you've been allowed to enact the club. The charter class for an institution, the charter class is the first graduating class of the institution, right? Like the charter class of high school. It is the first class that is enrolled in the school before it was granted its charter. That's why it's called the charter class. So chartered means allowed to exist, usually allowed to exist by the government, or in this case, by the crown. So that obviously chartered, in this case, the streets are in control of the government. Down below it says, given liberty, but also ironically preempted as private property and rented out. I don't think that that's an accurate reading. I think in this particular case, it means that they are chartered streets, means enacted by the government, near where the chartered Thames does flow. Now, this is ironic because the Thames is a river. Why does the Thames flow where it flows? Well, the Thames flows where it flows because of nature. It's not chartered by the government. It's not allowed to exist by the government. So the use of chartered here becomes ironic because the Thames is a natural thing. Now, what's actually happening with the Thames is that the Thames running through London at this particular point in history is really just a huge mudflat estuary. And the Thames has huge tides, partly because England is so far north. It's the top of England is in the Arctic Circle. It's so far north. As I said, London is equivalent with Vancouver. So it would be in Canada in the United States. So because it's so far north, it has these huge, massive tides. And so the Thames goes from being a river from shore to shore of the river down to a smaller river running through these huge mud flats. And it also has a tendency to flood. And so the government at this particular time is making a lot of efforts to control the flooding of the Thames. And so they're building locks upriver, both so you can take boats up the river, but also to control the water flow through. And there are actually rivers running through London now, the rivers running through London that are completely buried underground and running through these cisterns, through these Elizabethan constructed brick archways. That there used to be rivers there. Now they're completely underground and hidden. There's no evidence that there was ever a river there. So the Thames is being taken over by humans in a very real way, but also the natural world is being controlled through human perception. We see the world through what later he will call the mind-forged manacles. That we see the world through limited ways of perceiving that we have been taught by these artificial forms of government and religion. So the chartered Thames is ironically a contradiction to the chartered streets, because the streets literally are chartered, but the Thames isn't, except in the sense that it has become controlled by human perception. And then I mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. And so we've got 3 repetitions of the word mark, which means we got to pay attention to it. So what does the word mark mean? Well, the obvious sense, there's 2 obvious senses. The first time mark is used, it means notice. I mark in every face I meet. It means notice. I notice in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks I know of woe. And the second time means signs. Signs of weakness, signs of woe. That's the overt meaning of the word. But mark has another sense here. So what am I doing now? I'm making marks. So mark means to make marks. It's also a verb. It is a verb in notice, but it's another form of verb that means to make marks. So in fact, the speaker of this Songs of Experience, who's describing London, is he himself perhaps putting the marks of weakness and the marks of woe on the faces that he sees. because he himself is trapped within this world. So he's making the marks of weakness and marks of woe in the faces that he sees. It's not that they're not there, but it's also they're in him as well. And so he's seeing them through his perspective, which is noticing these particular things. On to the second stanza. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. All right, ban. Okay, so of course bans mean prohibitions issued by the government, but also a ban, and this is relevant below. Reading the bans is a tradition, actually it's a requirement in the Church of England. And it's a requirement because for centuries, poor people didn't go through a traditional wedding ceremony, believe it or not. What they would do is they would have, this is where the notion of a common law marriage comes from. What they would do is they would just decide, hey, we're going to get married, so let's cohabitate. And so they go live together without going through an official process, which means recording their marriage in the church registry, which was very important. Actually, there's several novels that turn upon the fact that marriages are recorded appropriately in the church registry of the church in which the people were married. And so this is actually encoded in the marriage ceremony with which you may be familiar. According to the rules, every week for 3 weeks before the weekend in which the people are married, they tended to be married on Saturdays. During the regular church service, they would read the banns. And read the banns means that they would read an announcement of all the people who plan to be married in the coming weeks. And the reason they do that is because there's not always a record of who's been married before. And so someone in the church will hear them reading the banns and they'll say, well, John is marrying Jane. And that person will say, well, isn't Jane married to George? And they'll go to the church and they'll go to the priest and say, or the minister and say, I think Jane is already married to George. She can't marry John. And so you know this because in the traditional marriage ceremony, and this figures very prominently in Jane Eyre, by the way. I'm sorry, I hope I didn't make that a spoiler alert. When the minister says, does anyone know of any reason these two cannot be lawfully joined in marriage? That is the last stage of reading the banns because they've been announcing the marriage for the previous 3 weeks. And someone in the church can stand up and say, I'm sorry, Jane is married to George. She can't marry John. And someone, we just brush through that. No one's supposed to stand up. But that was traditionally one of the reasons they did that. So someone who knew of a pre-existing marriage could speak up and prevent bigamy, which of course is a sin. So ban here becomes a symbol of marriage. And remember in Godwin, would be helpful to spell that correctly, wouldn't it? In Godwin and in Blake's cosmology, marriage is one of those human institutions that limits free love and limits human behavior. So in the bans, the reading of the bans, not only in prohibitions issued by the government, but also the reading of the bans issues the mind-forged manacles that come from the institution of traditional religion. And then, of course, we get the next stanza, we get the chimney sweeper from the previous 2 poems we were looking at, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. And that's a reference to the chimney sweeper poems. The churches, make up a heaven of our misery. And the hapless soldier's cry runs in blood down palace walls, because King Henry V notwithstanding, kings don't usually lead their soldiers into battle. Rather, they sit in the back and direct the soldiers off to die. And so the soldiers' blood literally paints the walls of the palace in which they hide while the soldiers are off dying for them. These are both references to the church and to the government, obviously, that Blake is criticizing here. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Okay, so this is a really very, sorry for the pun, pregnant verse. Of course, a youthful harlot would be a prostitute. London at this time, remember London at this time has a population of under 300,000, and there is an imagined population of something like 30,000 prostitutes making their living in London at this time. So that's 10% of the population. And one of the reasons that there is this tremendous number of prostitutes is because all these people who've been displaced to the city from the country and have no way of supporting themselves and are in the position where they're having to sell their children into slavery. And when you run out of children, what do? Well, you can starve to death and die of disease, or you can sell the only thing you have left to sell, which is your body. And so many, many, many poor women were forced into prostitution as a way of well, trying to survive and gain some money to feed themselves and maybe even feed their families. So prostitution is a very real problem. For Blake's belief is that prostitution is actually partially created by marriage. Sins are made with bricks of religion. Anyway, okay, so the youthful harlot's curse. Well, this could have two meanings. The curse could obviously mean swearing, swear words that we can't say because they're not socially correct. So a youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. And one of the problems that a prostitute would have is that there's no reliable form of prophylaxis in this particular time. They don't have reliable condoms. They have a version of a condom made by sheepskin, but it's expensive and most people don't use it. And so one of the possible consequences of engaging in prostitution is that you would have an illegitimate child who you would then curse, because you can't engage in prostitution when you're pregnant or carrying around a nursing infant. At least it's difficult. And so the curse, the infant becomes the curse of the prostitute, who then curses the infant. But also the other youthful harlot's curse is sexually transmitted infections. There is no reliable prophylaxis. There are no condoms, and sexual diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, are rampant throughout England. And if you are engaging in prostitution, you are going to have one. And not only are you going to have one, but you're going to pass it along to anyone who sleeps with you. And so the youthful harlot's curse is also slang for STIs. The harlot's curse, the prostitute's curse, is gonorrhea, syphilis, one of the other horrifying sexually transmitted infections. And although Blake didn't know it because that medicine hadn't progressed to that situation, sort of interesting, maybe Blake's prescient, that the infants born to women infected with sexually transmitted infections will often have those diseases. And one of the ways they get them is by, as they pass through the birth canal, they pick them up through the mucous membranes, through their nose and their eyes. Now, babies' noses are usually clotted with mucus to protect them from that sort of thing, but they also through their eyes. And so the baby would also be born with sexually transmitted infections. So the harlot's curse, the STI, would also curse the baby, blast the newborn infant's tear, and blight with plagues the marriage hearse. And of course, a hearse is associated with transporting corpses, dead bodies, not with transporting married couples. But in this particular case, remember, syphilis can be fatal if it's not treated. It can lead to insanity and death. So the youthful harlot's curse, the sexually transmitted infection of the youthful harlot, well, who is she sleeping with? Well, very often she's sleeping with a married man who then goes home and gives this disease to his wife, who gives it to the children she has afterwards. And so the harlot's curse, the sexually transmitted infection, also literally blights with plagues, the plagues of sexually transmitted infections, the marriage, so then the carriage that takes the couple away from marriage then actually becomes in some way the hearse, because once they sleep together, the wife will get the sexually transmitted infection from which she could die. So according to Blake, this very bleak version of the world is one in which human institutions have created all of this misery. And the only way of correcting this misery for Blake is to incorporate both the hopefulness of the songs of innocence and seeing the world in terms of the possibilities of what can be accomplished, and also the energy that comes along, or the optimism that comes along with that. And then on the other hand, the ability to see the truth of problems that comes along with experience, but also the energy to correct those problems, because clearly this person is angry, and anger is a source of correction. So Songs of Innocence and Experience is an attempt to achieve Blake's ability to unify these two contraries, to achieve the progression back away from the world of Ulro, or generations, toward Beulah and Eden, and correct human society. Now, in the next video, we're going to start looking at Wordsworth. And this is one of the consistencies between Blake and Wordsworth. They're incredibly different in almost every way. You're not even comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing apples and octopuses. But in this one manner, they are very much similar. And that is the idea to foster human sympathy as a way of correcting the ills of human society created by the humans themselves.